The Duelling Duchess. Chapter 1. The Gallery. The Ladies' Gallery of the House of Commons was not designed for comfort. This was, Imogen suspected, intentional. The benches were narrow, and the air was close, and the grille through which one observed the proceedings below was constructed at an angle that required either excellent posture or a crick in the neck, and no woman of her acquaintance had ever described an afternoon spent here as pleasant. They came regardless, because the alternative, remaining ignorant of legislation being enacted in one's name and about one's interests, was considerably less comfortable than any bench. She had been here 3 times this session. Today she had come specifically because her solicitor had sent word on Monday that the name Reverton was expected to be spoken in the afternoon's debates on agricultural land reform, and Imogen made it a principle never to be absent when her name was being used without her. The chamber below was in full cry, the particular kind of parliamentary energy that gathered when a subject was genuinely contested, when men were speaking from belief rather than obligation. She had sorted the speakers into categories during the first hour, those arguing from economic theory, those arguing from inherited assumption, and, rarer and more interesting, those arguing from direct knowledge. The man currently on his feet was in the 3rd category. She had registered him when he rose, perhaps 32, lean, with the kind of face that had been made striking by conviction rather than by birth. He spoke without notes, and he spoke in the specific language of someone who had walked the land he was describing. Not a gentleman farmer's language, but something more granular, more precise, more acquainted with drainage and soil type, and the particular difficulty of a wet spring on clay. She was listening with full attention when he said, "And nowhere is this monopoly more clearly illustrated than in the management of the Reverton estates in Northumbria, where 60,000 acres of productive farmland have been held under ducal title for 3 generations, concentrated in a single hand, rather than distributed among the families whose labour built its value." Imogen sat very still. Around her, 2 other women in the gallery shifted with the slight discomfort of those adjacent to someone being publicly discussed. She did not shift. She looked at the man below, at his straight back and his certain voice and the way he spoke her estates as if he had been there, which he had not, and felt, with the clean economy of someone who has spent a decade managing their own affairs, 2 things simultaneously. The first was anger, which was reasonable and which she set aside temporarily, because anger without information was merely noise. The second was interest, which was less expected and which she examined with the attention she gave to unexpected things. He concluded. The chamber responded with the mixed approval and dissent of a body that contained men who agreed and men who did not, which was, she supposed, the point of the exercise. She remained in the gallery until the session rose, then descended to the lobby and waited, because she had decided, in the precise way she decided most things, that leaving without speaking to the man would be an incomplete use of the afternoon. He came through the lobby with 2 colleagues, mid-conversation, and she stepped into his path with the composure of a woman who has spent 10 years being the most powerful person in most rooms and has stopped apologizing for it. "Mr. Cayle," she said. She had ascertained his name from the woman beside her in the gallery, who had whispered it with the slight emphasis of a woman sharing information she considered significant. He stopped. He looked at her, a look that processed, the black silk that was not mourning but was Imogen's particular preference for occasions that required authority, the title she wore like a second spine, the complete absence in her expression of either deference or hostility. Something moved in his face that was not quite surprise. "Your Grace," he said. He had placed her. Of course he had. He had just spoken her name in Parliament. "You have been to Reverton," she said, not accusation, inquiry. "No," he said, "I have not." She looked at him for a moment. "Then you have been speaking about 60,000 acres of land you have never seen, and the families whose labour built its value on the basis of, what? Second-hand report. Inference from general principles. His two colleagues had gone quiet. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been caught in something and is deciding whether to defend or acknowledge it. Something in his jaw suggested defense. Something in his eyes suggested the intelligence to know that defense in this particular case was not available. General principles, he said, and specific data. I have the land registry figures, the tenancy agreements on public record, You have the surface, she said pleasantly, the documents that describe the land. You have not been to see it. She looked at him with the full, precise attention that had unnerved better men than him. I would like to invite you to correct that. The lobby continued around them, members, clerks, the ordinary traffic of an afternoon parliament rising. His colleagues, with the good instincts of men who sensed they were observing something they would describe in clubs for the rest of the month, had taken a small step back. You are inviting me to Reverton, he said. I am suggesting, she said, that if you intend to continue naming my estates in legislative debate, you should at least know what you are naming. The invitation is professional. Come and see the land, meet the tenants, review the management accounts. She held out a card. She had them made because she had long since concluded that a duchess who carried cards was terrifying in precisely the right way. If your principles survive the encounter with the reality, you will be a more effective advocate for them. If they do not... She left the sentence at an angle that contained several possibilities. You may write to my secretary for the arrangements. She left him with the card and the lobby and two colleagues whose expressions, had she looked back, would have confirmed that she had just done exactly what she intended. She did not look back. Chapter 2. The Estate. He wrote to her secretary within the fortnight. Imogen read the letter herself. Her secretary, Fellows, had long since understood that all correspondence related to certain subjects was to be placed directly on her desk, and found it considerably better than she had expected. It was not supplicatory, and it was not aggressive. It acknowledged that his parliamentary references to Reverton had been based on record rather than direct observation, and that the offer to visit was one he took seriously as a professional obligation. He would come in August when Parliament recessed, if the arrangement was convenient. He had no expectation of being persuaded and made no promise of his conclusions. I make no promise of my conclusions was the sentence she read twice. She was accustomed to men who promised their conclusions in advance, usually the conclusions she wanted, delivered as though their agreement were a gift. This was something different. A man who was coming to look and reserved the right to see what was actually there. She wrote back herself, which Fellows noted without comment, and which was, as both of them knew, significant. He arrived on a Tuesday in August, on horseback rather than by carriage, with a single bag and no valet, which told her something before he dismounted. She received him in the estate office rather than the drawing room, which told him something in return. Your Grace, he said. Mr. Cayle. She gestured to the chair across the desk, the working desk, not the ceremonial one. I have prepared a schedule, 3 days, the home farms on the first day, the outlying tenancies on the second, the accounts and records on the third. You may revise it as you see fit. He looked at the schedule she pushed across the desk. It was detailed. She had made it detailed, because a schedule that revealed everything was more effective, in her experience, than one that concealed and allowed inference. The revelation of the real thing, when the real thing was as she knew it to be, was its own argument. This is thorough, he said. I have had the accounts going back 30 years prepared for your review. The tenancy records, the improvement expenditures, the drainage work, the school building at Harrow Village, all of it. She met his eyes, which were brown and direct, and were performing, she noticed, the same assessment as her own. A man who had spent his adult life reading people across political divides, who was doing so now, and who was finding, she suspected, something he had not anticipated. You named my estate in Parliament as an example of what is wrong with hereditary land concentration. I am giving you the opportunity to be thorough in your conclusions. Most people in your position would simply have written a letter of protest to the Speaker, he said. Most people in my position would have. I am not most people in my position. She stood, because the schedule was done and the first day should begin. I find that complaint is less effective than demonstration. Shall we start with the home farms? They started with the home farms. Frederick Cayle, and she was already thinking of him by his given name, which she noted as information about herself to be examined later, rode beside her across the Reverton fields in the August morning with the attention of a man who had been trained to observe, and was observing. He was quiet for long stretches, which she found she preferred to the men who narrated their impressions as they formed them. His questions, when they came, were specific. About drainage costs, about the arrangement with the local mill, about the terms on which the tenant farmers held their leases. She answered every question with the precision of someone who knew the answers, who had always known the answers, who had insisted on knowing them from the first month of her widowhood, when the estate's previous agent had arrived with a summary report, and she had asked for the underlying documents, and the man's expression had suggested no one had previously made that request. At midday they stopped at the Harrow Village Green, where the school building stood, 4 years old, built from estate funds, currently full of children audible through the open windows, in the way of children who are not yet aware they are being observed. Frederick looked at the building for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "This is not in the public record," he said. "No, it is in the estate accounts, which are not public." She looked at the building herself. She found she always looked at it. Every time she passed, the same small private satisfaction of a thing done, because it was right, and not because anyone was watching. "I had intended to expand it this winter. There is a question of whether the roof requires repair first." A pause. There is always a question of whether the roof requires repair first. Something moved in his expression. "How many children?" 37 currently. The numbers grow each year as the families come to trust that the thing will last. She looked at him directly. "They have been given things that lasted for a season before. By my predecessor. By the agent before fellows. They are careful about permanence." He looked at the school, and then at her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face. Something that was not the critical attention of the first day, not the parliamentary precision, but something more open in the process of revising. "I may have been," he said with care, "inexact in my parliamentary account." "May have been," she said, "was." The honesty of it was direct, and the directness was not performance. The land registry figures suggest concentration. They do not suggest what the concentration is doing. He paused. "I was arguing from what I could measure, not from what I could not." Imogen looked at him for a moment. This was the thing she had brought him here to arrive at, and he had arrived at it, and he had arrived there honestly, without requiring her to embarrass him into it or construct the path so carefully that he could not avoid it. He had simply looked at what was there and concluded accurately. She had not expected it to feel like this. "Come and see the second farm," she said. "The drainage work there is more recent. I want your opinion on whether the approach is replicable at scale in other estates." "My opinion?" he said, slightly startled. "You are a reformist MP with an interest in agricultural land management," she said, beginning to walk. "Your opinion on estate improvement methodology is not irrelevant. I am not asking out of courtesy." He fell into step beside her, and she was aware, in the way she was aware of things she examined later rather than immediately, that the distance between them was the natural distance of two people with a shared direction, and that neither of them had calculated it. Chapter 3. The Flood. The flood came in September, 3 weeks after Frederick's return to London, and it was the kind of flood that does not ask permission. The River Reverton, which ran along the western boundary of the home farms and which Imogen had been monitoring with increasing unease since July's heavy rains, finally departed its banks on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, 40 acres of the best wheat ground were underwater, and the drainage system in the lower fields, the new drainage system, built on her own specifications, which had cost 4 years of careful planning and 6 months of construction, was operating at the edge of its design capacity and might, the estate agent feared, fail entirely before the water receded. Imogen did not panic. She had not panicked in 10 years of managing an estate that had been left to her by a husband who had died before explaining half of it, and she did not intend to begin now. What she did, instead, was calculate. The water could not be stopped. It could be redirected. There were secondary drainage channels along the northern boundary that had never been formally incorporated into the estate's drainage plan. They predated the improvements. They were older and cruder, but they were there. The question was whether they could take the volume if the primary system failed. She did not know enough about hydraulic engineering to answer this with confidence. Her estate agent, Whitmore, was competent and loyal, but had never encountered anything on this scale. She thought, standing in her study at 6:30 on Friday morning, with the rain still coming and the reports from the lower fields arriving in sequence, of a man who had spent 3 days asking specific questions about drainage costs and whether the approach was replicable at scale, and who had known what she was asking when she asked his opinion. She wrote to Frederick Cayle before 7, not in the tone of a duchess requesting assistance, in the tone of a woman who has a problem, has identified a person who may know something relevant to it, and is asking directly. He arrived on Saturday afternoon, in the same single bag and on the same horse, in the middle of a rain that was still not done with its opinion. She was in the lower fields when he arrived, and came to find her there, which she appreciated. He had received a report from Whitmore of her location, and come directly, rather than waiting in the house. He arrived muddy to the knee, and looked at the flooding and at the drainage channels, and at the reports she handed him in the shelter of the field barn, with the concentrated attention she had seen him deploy in Parliament and at Reverton in August, and that she had come to identify as the particular quality of his mind at work. "The secondary channels," he said after 20 minutes with the maps. "My thought as well, but the capacity. The eastern one is sufficient if it's cleared. The northern needs a temporary sluice here." He pointed on the map at a junction that she had identified as the critical point. "If you can get men to it by this evening. The volume from the primary system can be managed until tomorrow morning, I think, but not beyond." He looked up from the map. "You have the men." 12 available. More by evening if Whitmore can reach the outlying farms. "Then it can be done." He looked at her steadily, the brown eyes, rain-damp and entirely present. "I need to look at the junction in person before I'm certain. Will you come?" "I was already going," she said. They went. They spent 4 hours in the September rain doing the work, not directing it from a distance but in it, with the men, at the junction where the temporary sluice was going to determine whether 40 acres of wheat ground survived or didn't. Frederick worked with the same physical directness she had noted when he arrived on horseback rather than carriage, and she worked beside him with the practical efficiency of a woman who had been managing Reverton for a decade and had long since stopped performing the graceful distance that was expected of a duchess in her own fields. It worked, not elegantly, and not without the kind of effort that left everyone present exhausted and soaked, and in the particular good humour of people who have done something difficult together and succeeded. The sluice held. The eastern channel took the redirected volume. By nightfall, the primary system was no longer in danger of failing. She thanked the men, by name, each of them, which she always did, and which Whitmore had told her they noted, and walked back to the house with Frederick in the dark, and neither of them spoke for some time, because there was a quality to the post-crisis silence that does not require filling. At the house door, she said, "Come in. You cannot ride back to the inn tonight in this." "I had not planned to," he said. And then, with the slight awkward honesty she had come to identify as characteristic, I should tell you that I did not intend to suggest anything improper by— I know, she said. I have 8 guest rooms, a housekeeper of ferocious propriety, and the social independence of a duchess. Nothing improper will be suggested by anything I choose to do in my own house. She looked at him. Come in, Frederick. He came in. They ate in the kitchen because the formal dining room was dark, and the kitchen was warm, and they were both still damp, and the kitchen had bread and cold meat, and a very good fire, and the housekeeper produced it all with the expression of a woman managing the situation and having opinions about it that she would deliver to her husband later. I want to say something, Frederick said, over the bread and cold meat. Then say it. He looked at the fire. I have been speaking about land reform in Parliament for 3 years, about the concentration of land in hereditary titles, about the tenants who hold their livelihoods on the grace of families they've never met, about the necessity of reform. He paused. I spoke about Reverton because it was the most prominent local example I could cite. I had never been here. No. What I have seen, in the 3 days in August and today— He stopped, reformulated. You are doing what I have been arguing for, the school, the drainage investment, the lease terms, the improvement of the tenancies. You are doing the thing I have been standing up in Parliament to demand. He looked at her directly. And I named you as an example of the problem. You named me as an example of concentration, she said. You were not entirely wrong. The concentration is real. The question is what it does, and in whose hands, and to whose benefit. She set down her glass. Your mistake was not the principle. It was the assumption that the principle applied uniformly, that every duchess was the same duchess. Yes. Direct, and without qualification. Which is, she said, allowing herself the thing she had been precise enough to withhold until now. The same mistake that members of Parliament make regularly about me. That being a duchess means being a particular kind of person, ornamental, dependent, manageable. She looked at him steadily. You made an evidential error, Frederick. It is a correctable kind of mistake. He looked at her for a long moment, the reformist MP who had ridden into her estate in August, determined to see it clearly, and who had, over the course of a very long wet day, been looking at something else clearly too. What am I looking at? He said. Honest, direct, the question that was not quite the question they had been building toward, but was the one below it. You are looking at Reverton, she said. And then, because she was a woman who had not survived 10 years of her own life by being imprecise, and at its duchess. The fire burned low, and the kitchen was warm, and the rain had finally stopped outside, and the secondary drainage channel was holding, and Frederick Cayle looked at Imogen Stafford, Duchess of Reverton, and said nothing, because some things are already said. Chapter 4. The Legislation. The bill came before Parliament in November. It was not the bill Frederick had originally intended to introduce, not the direct reform measure that would have challenged hereditary land tenure in terms that would have required Imogen, and a dozen others like and unlike her, to answer for the concentration itself. It was something more sophisticated, a bill that established a framework for model estate management, drainage standards, tenancy protections, investment requirements for educational provision, tied to a system of incentive and accountability. A bill that argued in its preamble that the question of land concentration was less important than the question of what concentration was doing. He had written it over September and October and sent her drafts through the parliamentary recess, and she had annotated them with the same red ink precision she applied to anything requiring analysis, and he had revised on the basis of her annotations, and she had revised her annotations on the basis of his revisions, and they had exchanged 14 letters about drainage standards alone. The 14th letter was not entirely about drainage standards. She had been aware of this shift since Reverton in August, though she had catalogued it with the care she gave to things that required careful handling, not suppression, but precision. She had been a duchess for 10 years. and a woman managing her own affairs for all of them, and she knew the particular complication of a man who could not quite separate admiration of her capability from regard for her person. She had encountered it before, and what she had always found was that the admiration was clear enough, but whether the regard could sustain the person, the whole person, including the inconvenient opinions and the red ink annotations and the 12 tenant farmers thanked by name at the end of a long, wet day, was a different question. The 14th letter had been about drainage standards for most of its length, and about something else in its final paragraph, which had begun. I find that I am increasingly unable to attribute my interest in the bill's success entirely to its legislative merits. She had read that paragraph 3 times. Then she had written back on the subject of the bill's final clause about tenancy notification periods, and had said nothing about the final paragraph, because she was not yet ready to give him a sentence he could quote back at her, and because she wanted to see what he would do with silence on the subject. What he did was come to London in November for the bill's introduction and call on her at Reverton House on the afternoon before the debate and stand in her drawing room with the careful honesty that was his most consistent quality and say, "I sent you a letter in October, the last paragraph." "I received it," she said. "You didn't respond to it." "I responded to the clause about tenancy notification periods." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I am not certain whether that means the paragraph was unwelcome, or whether you—" He stopped, tried again. "I have been very good at saying difficult things in Parliament, and not very good at this." "This," she said. "This." He gestured, a small, uncharacteristic gesture, the precise economy of a man who moves carefully and is currently not being careful. "I have been thinking about you since August, with a regularity that has nothing to do with the bill. I have read your annotations on drainage standards with a degree of attention that is not proportionate to the subject of drainage. I have—" He stopped again. "I am aware that you are a duchess, and that I am a merchant's son from Northampton, and that I have spent 3 years publicly arguing against the hereditary class to which you belong. I am aware of all of that. I find I am unable to make it matter more than the other thing." Imogen looked at him in her drawing room, the man who had ridden to Reverton on horseback and asked her opinion on agricultural methodology and worked 4 hours in the rain and revised a parliamentary bill 14 times on the basis of her annotations. "In Parliament," she said carefully, "last year, when you named Reverton, I was wrong." "You were incomplete," she said, "which is different." She looked at the window, the November street, the grey light of a city preparing for winter. "I have been named in Parliament as a problem before, by men who believed the problem was that I existed and was capable and would not be managed, by men who found my opinions effortful." She looked back at him. "You named me as an example of structural inequity, which is a substantively different objection and one I have more respect for, even when wrongly applied." "I understand the distinction," he said quietly. "I know you do." She stood from her chair and moved to the window because she thought better on her feet, and this required thinking. The grey November light was flat and honest and good for clarity. "I have been independent for 10 years, Frederick. The independence is not incidental. It is not a situation I am in. It is what I am. Any arrangement that did not account for that would be worse than no arrangement at all." "I know," he said. "I would not propose an arrangement that asked you to be other than you are. I am not—" He looked at her steadily. "I argued against the monopoly, not against the person holding it. And the person holding it is someone I have a great deal of admiration for and would like, very much, to know beyond letters about drainage standards." "The admiration," she said. "Is it for the capability or for the person?" He considered the question, genuinely considered it, which she noted. "I don't think I can separate them," he said at last. "The capability is the person. The woman who built the school at Harrow Village because it was right, and thanked 12 men by name at the end of a long wet day, and wrote 14 letters about drainage with the same precision she brings to everything. That is not separate from the person I find I cannot stop thinking about. It is the same thing. Imogen stood at the window in the November light and allowed herself, for a moment, to feel the full weight of what he had said. Not perform composure around it, but actually feel it. It was, in her experience, a rare thing to be seen as a whole without the capability being the price of the regard, or the regard being a prettified version of the capability. To be seen as the same thing, entire. "I have opinions about the tenancy notification clause," she said. "I know," he said. "I welcome them." "I have opinions about most things. I will continue to have them. I will express them in parliamentary correspondence and in drawing rooms and in wet fields in September, and I will not moderate them for the comfort of anyone who finds them effortful. I would not ask you to." "You would disagree with me in Parliament," she said. "We would continue to disagree about certain things. Publicly." "Yes." No hesitation. "I think we would argue better with each other than with most people we agree with." This, she thought, was the truest thing either of them had said. She turned from the window and looked at him, the merchant's son from Northampton who had ridden into her estate on horseback and revised his conclusions on the basis of evidence, and revised his bill on the basis of her annotations, and felt, with the directness she brought to conclusions she had reached entirely, that she had been here before, only in the sense that she had been moving toward here for some time. "You may call again tomorrow," she said, "after the debate. I want to know how the tenancy clause was received." "And the other matter?" "The other matter," she said, "will also benefit from the additional 24 hours. She looked at him steadily. "I am a careful woman, Frederick. I reach conclusions deliberately." "I know," he said. "I have read your annotations." The ghost of it, the thing she rarely allowed, the private expression that was not performance, moved across her face. "Then you know the conclusion is the same whether I delay it or not. I am simply making certain of the reasoning." He stood in her drawing room and looked at her and said nothing, because he was a man who had learned to listen, and she was a woman who had learned that listening was its own kind of declaration. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed, and went with him to the door herself, without the butler, which was, as both of them understood, a statement of a specific kind. The debate ran for 4 hours. Imogen watched from the ladies' gallery in the same seat she had occupied in the spring, when a man she did not know had spoken her name in the chamber below. She had come again specifically because she had made it a principle never to be absent when important things were happening, and because the bill that was being argued for below had been partially constructed on her own thinking, and because, she admitted this to herself in the straightforward way she admitted things she had concluded, she wanted to see him argue. He was very good. Not the good of a man performing conviction, but the good of a man who knows precisely what he thinks and has the words for it. He handled the opposition's objections with the particular combination of courtesy and precision that she had come to recognize as his signature, acknowledging what was legitimate, dismantling what was not, and doing both in language clear enough that the gallery could follow the argument without the chamber's insider knowledge. He cited Reverton, not as a problem this time, but as a model. She sat in the narrow, uncomfortable bench of the ladies' gallery and listened to a man who had come to her estate on horseback and revised his conclusions on the basis of evidence describe the Harrow Village School and the drainage improvements and the tenancy terms in the specific language of someone who had been there and seen the thing, and she felt, with the full and honest acknowledgement she gave to things she had concluded, that she was very glad she had given him the 14 letters and the red ink annotations and the 4 hours in the September rain. The tenancy notification clause passed. The bill as a whole was referred for committee, which was not passage, but was not defeat, and was further than any comparable measure had gone in 3 sessions. He found her in the lobby afterward. He was still in the animated state of a man who has argued well in public and is still running on the energy of it, and he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has done a thing in which another person had a hand and wants that person to know. "The clause," she said. It passed. He was, she noticed, slightly breathless, not from exertion. "The committee will be thorough, but Pemberton thinks it will survive. He has 2 members he believes can be persuaded on the—" "Frederick." He stopped. "I have completed the reasoning," she said. He was still. "You argued well," she said. "You cited Reverton accurately. You revised the bill on the basis of evidence, and you argued for it on the basis of principle, and the principle was sound, and the evidence supported it." She looked at him steadily in the parliamentary lobby, with the members and the clerks, and the whole apparatus of the chamber still in motion around them. "That is not unrelated to the other matter." "No?" he said. "The man who can revise his conclusions when the evidence requires it is the same man I have been corresponding with about drainage standards. They are not separate things. It is the same thing." She gave his own reasoning back to him, precisely. "And I find that I cannot make the title and the merchant's son and 3 years of parliamentary opposition matter more than the other thing." He looked at her in the lobby of the House of Commons, and something in his face moved into the uncalculated, the full, unguarded expression of a man who has been precise and disciplined and careful for a long time and is, for this moment, none of those things. "The Reverton drainage model," he said, and his voice was not quite steady in the way it was always steady when he was speaking from performance rather than from himself, "will require continued refinement over the coming years." "It will," she agreed. "I will need to return to the estate, regularly." "You will be welcome." She looked at him, at the merchant's son who had argued against her by principle and been entirely wrong and entirely honest about being wrong, and had then spent 5 months building something that made the principle better. "Come to dinner on Saturday. I want your opinion on the Eastern Channel's long-term capacity, and I have thoughts about the committee strategy for the 3rd clause." "And the other matter?" "The other matter," she said, "will be discussed in a context that does not involve parliamentary lobbies and the entirety of the legislative class within earshot." He smiled. The real smile, the one that was not managed or public or constructed for the chamber. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. She walked out of the parliamentary lobby with the composure that was not performance, but simply hers, and stepped into the November Street and permitted herself, in the private interior of a woman who had managed her own life for 10 years and intended to continue doing so, a quiet and thorough satisfaction. The bill was in committee. The drainage was holding. The school at Harrow Village was full of children whose names she knew. And on Saturday, a merchant's son from Northampton who rode on horseback and argued well and annotated drainage standards was coming to dinner. The Duchy of Reverton had, in its 3-generation history, seen a great many dinners. It had not, Imogen thought, seen quite this one. They were engaged by Christmas. It was not announced in the conventional way, no morning call, no formal notice in the papers delivered with the language of grateful families and suitable matches. It was announced eventually because things of that nature could not remain unannounced, but the announcement was theirs to make, and they made it in their own time and in their own language. What preceded the announcement was a Saturday dinner that ran until midnight and covered the Eastern Channel's long-term capacity and the committee strategy for the 3rd clause and the question of whether the Harrow School building could be extended without compromising the roof, and at the end of which Frederick Cayle said, in the kitchen of Reverton House where the fire was low and the bread and cold meat had made a reappearance in the manner of things that work, that he intended to propose and was informing her in advance because she was a woman who liked to have information before it arrived at her in formal terms. She had told him she was aware and had been waiting for the reasoning to conclude. He had said the reasoning had been complete since August. She had said she knew and had been waiting for him to know she knew. He had laughed, the real laugh, the unguarded one, and proposed, and she had accepted, and the terms had been discussed with the practical thoroughness that characterized everything they did together. And the terms were equal in every particular, because they were both people who understood that the important things were the things you built rather than the things you inherited. In Parliament that winter, it was noted that the Duchess of Reverton's influence on the Land Reform Committee was being exercised with unusual directness, and that her particular ally on the matter appeared to be the reformist member for Northampton, who had been observed arguing with her in public on at least 3 occasions since the engagement was announced, and who appeared to find this entirely satisfactory. Those who knew them understood that the arguing was the point. Those who knew them best understood that it had always been. End. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the little bell so you are notified the moment the next story is published. Until our next edition, may your days be filled with grace and your nights with the promise of romance.